9 days before Adolf Hitler shot himself in a Berlin bunker, a naked 57-year-old German general was dragged into the gray dawn of a concentration camp courtyard. No uniform, no dignity, no trial, just a thin hemp rope, what prisoners called piano wire, looped over a meat hook. The executioners were in no hurry. This method of killing was deliberately slow. In some cases, the condemned man strangled for 20 full minutes before death finally arrived. His name was Hans Oster, and the man who ordered his death was the same man he had spent 12 years trying to destroy from the inside. If you're new here, welcome to Untold War Story, where we dig into the chapters of history that most people never hear about. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories we cover don't end with the history books. They start where the history books stop. July 20, 1944, East Prussia, Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was supposed to be dead by lunchtime. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg had personally placed a bomb-loaded briefcase under the map table inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair, a heavily fortified military headquarters buried deep in the forests of Rastenburg. The explosion was catastrophic. The wooden conference barrack was completely destroyed. 4 men died. But Hitler, by a grotesque twist of fate, survived, shielded by the thick oak leg of the table that someone had casually kicked the briefcase against just minutes before detonation. Within hours, the greatest internal conspiracy in Nazi Germany's history had collapsed. Hitler was furious in a way that went beyond rage. It was something closer to a religious experience of betrayal. He would spend the next 9 months hunting down every man, woman, and associate connected to the plot. Over 7,000 people were arrested. Nearly 5,000 were executed. Some were hanged on meat hooks with thin wire, filmed on Hitler's personal orders so he could watch the footage himself. Hans Oster was already in custody, but the worst was still coming. To understand how a decorated German general ended up dying naked on a meat hook, you have to understand who Hans Oster actually was, and what turned him from a loyal officer into the most dangerous spy inside Nazi Germany. Hans Paul Oster was born on August 9, 1887, in Dresden, then part of the German Empire. His father was a Protestant pastor for the French Reformed congregation in the city, a man of deep moral conviction and rigid principle. Those qualities passed directly to his son. Oster completed his secondary education and made a decisive choice. He would pursue a military career. In 1907, he joined the artillery. By 1912, he had married Gertrude Knoop, and together they would have 3 children. When the First World War erupted on July 28, 1914, Oster served on the Western Front with distinction. By 1916, he had earned a promotion to Hauptmann, equivalent to captain, serving within the German general staff. He was by every measure a model officer. Then came November 11, 1918, Germany surrendered. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, hit Germany like a second defeat. The country was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, stripped of Alsace-Lorraine and all overseas colonies, and saddled with reparations payments so enormous they wouldn't be fully paid off until 2010. Germany's army was gutted, capped at a mere 100,000 troops. No submarines, no air force, no conscription. For professional soldiers like Oster, it was humiliation carved in stone. He stayed in the reduced army, rising to major by 1929. But in 1932, his career hit a wall. He was forced to resign after an affair with a fellow officer's wife. It was a personal scandal that, in hindsight, freed him for something far more consequential. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Like many conservative military officers, Oster initially saw promise in the new regime. The Nazis talked about restoring German pride, reversing Versailles, and returning Germany to greatness. Oster joined the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, just months after the Nazis took power. But the reality of Nazi rule moved fast, and it was ugly. By March 1933, the first concentration camp opened at Dachau. Political opponents, socialists, communists, trade unionists, were being beaten, imprisoned, and disappeared. In May 1933, Nazi students burned thousands of books in public squares across Germany, calling it a cleansing of un-German ideas. Jewish-owned businesses were boycotted. Pastors who refused to align their churches with Nazi ideology were arrested. Oster, raised in a household of Protestant principle, watched all of this with growing disgust. But the moment that permanently broke his loyalty came in the summer of 1934, the night of the Long Knives. Between June 30 and July 2, 1934, Hitler's SS secretly murdered dozens of people in a coordinated purge. Their primary targets were members of the SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, whose leader Ernst Röhm had become too powerful and too independent for Hitler's liking. But the killing didn't stop there. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was shot dead in his home, and Major General Ferdinand von Bredow, the former head of the Abwehr and one of Oster's personal friends, was also murdered. No arrests, no trials, no charges, just execution. Oster made a decision that day that would define the rest of his life. He would destroy the Nazi regime from the inside. In 1935, under the new Abwehr Chief Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Oster began quietly constructing a shadow network. He cultivated contacts inside the military, the civil service, and the intelligence services, men who hated Hitler but needed someone to coordinate them. He was meticulous, patient, and extraordinarily brave, because one wrong word to the wrong person meant the Gestapo. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair of early 1938 pushed him further. Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg was forced to resign after it emerged he had married a woman with a criminal past. Simultaneously, Army Commander-in-Chief Werner von Fritsch was falsely accused of homosexual conduct, a fabricated Gestapo smear designed to remove him. Canaris and Oster investigated and eventually proved Fritsch's innocence. But the damage was done. Hitler used the crisis to appoint himself Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, merging military and political power in his own hands. It was during this chaos that Oster first met Colonel General Ludwig Beck, chief of the German General Staff. Beck shared his revulsion at Hitler's direction. Together they began planning the first serious military coup, to be triggered if Hitler moved against Czechoslovakia. Franz Halder, Beck's successor as chief of staff, privately called Hitler the incarnation of evil and was drawn into the conspiracy. Oster did the logistical work. He used the Abwehr's resources to forge documents, screen conspirators, connect resistance cells across Germany, and provide cover for clandestine meetings. He even dispatched secret envoys to Britain, urging the British government to stand firm against Hitler during the Sudeten crisis, hoping that a credible military confrontation would give the German generals the justification they needed to act. Then, on September 29-30, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and handed Hitler the Sudetenland on a silver plate. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." In Germany, Hitler was celebrated as the greatest statesman alive. The coup evaporated overnight. 1 year later, on September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The war had begun. What Oster did next was either the most courageous act of the entire war, or, depending on your perspective, an act of treason. Historians still argue about it today. Convinced that he had to sabotage Hitler's military machine at any cost, Oster began secretly passing classified German military plans to his close friend Bert Sass, the Dutch military attaché in Berlin. He warned Sass about the planned German invasion of the Netherlands more than 20 times, including the precise postponed dates as Hitler kept delaying the operation. In one conversation, Oster referred to Hitler as the pig who has departed for the front in the West, code that the invasion was finally coming. Sass passed every warning to his government. The Dutch government didn't believe him. On May 10, 1940, German forces invaded France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands simultaneously. All 4 countries were conquered within 6 weeks. Oster had tried to stop it. The intelligence was real. The warnings were accurate. No one listened. Between 1940 and 1942, German resistance reached its lowest point. Hitler's armies were winning everywhere, and popular support for the regime was at its peak. But Oster kept working, rebuilding broken networks and establishing contact with resistance cells inside the military, including a key group led by Colonel Henning von Tresckow in Army Group Center. By 1942, Oster had been promoted to General Major, effective December 1, 1942. In early 1943, Oster's network supplied British-manufactured explosives to Tresckow's team for 2 assassination attempts on Hitler. The first, in March 1943, involved a bomb smuggled onto Hitler's private aircraft, but a faulty detonator left it silent. Days later, Colonel Rudolf von Gersdorf hid explosives on his body inside a Berlin museum, intending to detonate them while standing next to Hitler during an exhibition tour. Hitler left early. Gersdorf spent frantic minutes in a bathroom disarming the bomb strapped to his chest. Then, in April 1943, the Gestapo came for Hans von Dohnanyi, one of Oster's closest collaborators inside the Abwehr. Dohnanyi had used Abwehr cover to smuggle 14 Jewish men and women into Switzerland, disguising them as intelligence operatives. During the arrest, Dohnanyi whispered one word to Oster across the room: "Note." There were incriminating documents lying in plain sight on the desk. Oster lunged for them. The Gestapo grabbed him immediately. He was forced to hand the documents back, placed under house arrest, and dismissed from the Abwehr. It was over, or so the Gestapo believed. After the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt failed, Oster was arrested within 24 hours. For months, he sat in custody as the Nazi security apparatus worked its way through the conspiracy's paper trail. Then came April 4, 1945, just 5 weeks before Germany's final surrender. Gestapo investigators discovered the private diaries of Admiral Canaris, hidden in a safe at Abwehr headquarters. The diaries documented years of conspiracy in precise detail. When Hitler read the summary report, witnesses described his reaction as a kind of deranged fury. He issued an immediate verbal order. All current and past conspirators were to be executed at once. Hans Oster was on the list. 5 days later, in the cold gray pre-dawn of April 9, 1945, with Soviet artillery audible in the distance and Allied forces already deep inside Germany, gallows were hastily erected in the courtyard of Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria. Hans Oster, 57 years old, was ordered to remove his clothing. He was led outside naked. By Hitler's specific personal order, he was hanged using a thin hemp rope looped over a metal meat hook, the method German prisoners called piano wire. The technique was deliberately designed to prolong death. Accounts from Flossenbürg survivors describe executions by this method lasting up to 20 minutes. On the same morning, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer were executed in the same courtyard. 23 days later, Adolf Hitler killed himself in a Berlin bunker. Hans Oster was buried in the Nordfriedhof Cemetery in Dresden. After the war, he was recognized as one of the most active and consequential figures in the German resistance, a man who used his position inside the Nazi intelligence machine to sabotage the regime at every turn, at enormous personal cost. Fabian von Schlabrendorf, one of the very few senior anti-Nazis who survived the war, described Oster as a man such as God meant men to be, lucid and serene of mind, imperturbable in danger. He was not a perfect man. He had personal failings and made decisions that historians still debate. But when it counted most, Hans Oster looked directly at the most powerful and murderous regime in modern history and chose to fight it alone, from the inside, knowing exactly what it would cost him. That is the untold story of General Hans Oster, a man history almost forgot. If this story hit different, share it with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II. Subscribe to Untold War Story for more buried history that never made the textbooks. Drop a comment below. Would you have had the courage to do what Hans Oster did? We read every single one. See you in the next one.